Welcome to Cloud4Green Technologies. This session, we would be learning about AWS security services, and one of the key services, NAT Gateway. What is NAT Gateway and why we need to use and when we can use this? NAT Gateway enable instances in a private subnet to connect to the internet and other services and prevent the internet from initiating a connection with those instances, which means it's a one-way traffic. NAT gateway will help you to get internet connection to your VM in subnet, and any external users who is trying to connect to a VM in subnet, that is private subnet, would not be allowed direct connection, which means you will not get to connect to that machine because private subnet is not directly connected to a internet gateway, and virtual machines within the private subnet will receive internet connection only through NAT gateway. To understand this better, let's bring up a paint. As you all know, VPC is nothing but collection of subnets, and within the VPC you can have a subnet with public internet access and also a subnet with internal access, that is private access. So let's take an example. I have a subnet 1 public and I have subnet 2 private. Any virtual machine which you create on a subnet would be by default connecting to internet because we have internet gateway which is attached to the VPC. So in this case, I have internet gateway which is in attached condition or associated condition with VPC. Let's call it as internet gateway. Internet gateway and an external user. Let's take an external user. If you would like to connect cloud machine, that is VM1 public, then you'll initiate a connection like this. This user, let's take an example. Bhaskar is a user who wishes to connect to a cloud machine which is built on subnet 1 public. Then he has to go through internet gateway, whereas a virtual machine which is built inside a private subnet and that has configured with NAT gateway. So let me call NAT gateway. Let's call this machine as NAT gateway. Will allow internet access by connecting to internet gateway like this. See, the traditional machine, that is VM1 public, had a direct access to internet gateway, but the machine which is built it in subnet to private, if this machine needs an internet connection, then it has to go through via internet gateway. To be more specific, let me directly provide a connection to this machine. Yeah. So VM1 have direct connections to internet gateway. Okay, and whereas subnet 1 doesn't have any direct connection to internet gateway, it has to go through via NAT gateway. NAT gateway is acting like a router to this machine. If this machine need example, let's call this machine as VM2 private. If this machine needs internet connection, then it has to route the request. It has to go ahead and take the request. It has to go and request NAT gateway. NAT gateway in turn connected to internet gateway. So NAT gateway is getting a resolution from internet gateway. So NAT gateway would be in a position to resolve the request from VM2. And remember, a hacker who wishes to connect directly from an external directly or through internet gateway, let's call like this specific path would be disallowed, or he'll not have an access to this machine directly. He cannot connect like even though if he connects to internet gateway, you will not have direct access to this machine. Okay, in that way we are securing our virtual machine in private subnet. Yeah, now you can ask me a production use case, like when and where we can make use of NAT gateway. NAT gateway is primarily used in um, production subnet. I mean, primarily used in production for securing CEO machine or business critical machine or production machines, which should be kept under DMZ, that is dematerialized zone, which means a machine which is kept under private subnet would not be exposed directly to internet. Okay, that is called dematerialized zone, and this will give a layer of security where external attacks or hacks would not be directly allowed to connect. Okay, this is all about NAT gateway. Yeah, now you can also observe this. See, I have mentioned NAT gateway within subnet 1 public. Why we need to assign this NAT gateway inside this public subnet? As you know, in a network environment, all devices are considered as network nodes. Even NAT gateway required one public IP, and NAT gateway also required one private IP. As like we have VM1 with the default private IP, let's take an example. 10.0.0.0/24 is a subnet for subnet 1 public. In that case, VM1 public required public IP, let's call it as 4. Similarly, NAT gateway do require a private IP. And also VM1 required a public IP to connect to the external world. Sorry, VM1 required a public IP so that an external user connect to this machine. Same thing here, network gateway also required on public IP. Okay, so that it connects to internet gateway. Okay, now let's come back to this. NAT gateway supports speed of 5 Gbps and that can scale up to 45 Gbps. NAT gateway is primarily used, as I mentioned, for security reasons, and definitely that do require internet access. Let's take here in this case VM2 private required internet connection where it need to update patches, example Microsoft packet patches. So the traffic is one way, the traffic will flow like this. This machine will get internet connection, that's for sure, so that it can send a request and receive the request, that is only to NAT gateway, whereas an external user is not allowed to connect directly. I mean, it's not allowed to connect to this machine. Okay, right. Now, NAT gateway supports all three protocols like TCP, UDP, and ICMP. NAT gateway can support up to 55,000 simultaneous connections to each destination. So, which means what? NAT gateway is capable of routing the traffic like 55,000. Okay, it's that much powerful, which is primarily used for security purpose. Right. Now let's look into the practical lab, and we'll do it practically. We'll deploy a VPC, public subnet, private subnet, and all other default required components, and we'll demonstrate practically now. Yeah, the first thing is we need to build up a VPC. Currently, I am in North Virginia region, and I'm going to quickly build a VPC. VPC is a virtual network, and as I mentioned in the example, I'm going to use 10 dot series IP ranges. VPC is collection of subnet. So now I'm going to create a subnet. VPC can have private subnet as well as public subnet. As per this lab, I'm going to deploy my first subnet. Let me call it as public-subnet 1 and public-subnet 1 and the CIDR range 10.0.0.0/24, so that I can restrict my subnet to 251 hosts. So I'm just keeping a smaller network. So actually we need only one machine in the subnet, and keeping the smallest subnet would be good when you're testing. So I'll just keep this. I have just created a public subnet. Now I'm going to create a private subnet. Private subnet to CIDR range. This is the second available IP range in 10.0.0.0/16 address space. So now you all can see there are two different subnets. One is called public subnet 1 and the other one is called private subnet 2. By default, when a VPC is created, a default route table is created. You can see there is a route table is created. Now I'm going to make some changes to this route table. Let me call it as public route table. And also we required one more route table. So let's stick into the steps now. Yeah, edit the default route table name as public route table and the subnet association associate public subnet. Right. So let me rename it as public -rt, and under subnet association I am adding only public subnet, so that private subnet gets associated to a new route table with the name private-rt. So here first one is my public subnet. We can say this public subnet 1. Let me associate this. Yeah, I can see this subnet 1 is associated. Excuse me. Yeah, moving on to a new route table. Let me call it as private RT, pointing to the same VPC. Create. Now I'm gonna associate private subnet. Edit, and this one, second one is my private subnet. Let me associate this, and you can see private subnet is associated. Now create a NAT gateway in public subnet 1. Yeah, before this, there are prerequisites. There are few prerequisites that should be set it up prior we proceed to the next step. So let me look into those prerequisites. Number one is internet gateway. Make sure we have internet gateway that is associated to public subnet. I'll click on create internet gateway. And this needs to be associated to VPC. Actions attached to VPC. Select your VPC attached to internet gateway. If you look into this diagram, you can see this VPC is attached to. You can see VPC is attached to internet gateway, so that public subnet or subnet 1 public will get internet connection. Next one is security group. Security group is primarily used for controlling incoming and outgoing traffic. So by default, security group will have custom rule where it will allow only a specified node or a network range will have access to incoming connections. So here I'm in inbound edit inbound rules where I need to allow all users, anyone in the world can connect to this machine without any restriction. Since we are in learning phase, you can keep it anywhere, but in production, this would be set it to custom and there will be a specified address range would be mentioned. So now for learning purpose, we can keep it to anywhere. Outbound rules, same thing. So we can set it to anywhere and save the rules. Okay, now you can see I have inbound rule built with all traffic for IPv4 and IPv6 is allowed, and similarly all traffic for IPv4 and IPv6 are allowed. So this is IPv4 address with 32-bit and this is IPv6 address with 128-bit. Okay, you don't need to think too much about this. It's a default configuration. We set it to make sure that it will allow incoming traffic and outgoing traffic to and fro to a virtual machine traffic. Okay, now route table. As you know, we have built, we have renamed the default route table as public route table and we have associated public subnet to this. Now, public subnet range, what you see here, will not have a route to connect to internet gateway. We need to manually update this information via routes option. So I'll click on routes, edit routes, add a route, and now I'm going to give access to internet gateway. So as you know, if subnet 1 needs internet connection, you see here. As you can see this, VM1 public is a virtual machine. If this machine need internet connection, it has to flow like this. It has to touch a subnet and subnet in turn should connect to internet gateway. So that's what I'm set up now. Edit routes, you can see. So here you can see destination IP address as 0, 0, 0, 0/0, which means any IP address in the world. If my internal private network, which is defined in 10.0.0/16 series, that is public subnet. If it is want to connect to the external world, then it has to go via internet gateway. Okay, yeah. Now let's come back to, yeah, let's be on the public route table. And now, as you know, as per this diagram, NAT gateway also be part of public subnet. So which means I need to create NAT gateway pointing to subnet 1. So how to create a NAT gateway? So on your networking dashboard or VPC dashboard on your left, here you can see NAT gateway. Click on create an NAT gateway. You can provide a name. I'll call it as NAT gateway itself. Subnet, as you see, select a public subnet to which the NAT to be created, because NAT gateway is acting like a node or a router. A router required a public IP address so that it can communicate to internet. Same thing here. I'll select my public subnet 1, and as I mentioned earlier, the NAT gateway required a private IP as well as a public IP. So now it's a time for us to attach a elastic IP or a public IP to this machine. I'll click on create NAT gateway. Now NAT gateway is set. Let's navigate to route table. Now private route table doesn't have any routes to connect to internet gateway. You see this here. There is no route. If private subnet virtual machine wants to connect to internet, then it has to go through via NAT gateway. So in that case, I need to add a route pointing to NAT gateway. You can see this in a public subnet. I have mentioned any IP in the, I have assigned 5 zeros and then I pointed to internet gateway. But for a private route table, I'm adding NAT gateway so that any request which is coming from VM to private, that has to go through via NAT gateway, and NAT gateway in turn connected to internet gateway so that it will get a resolution. Save routes. Now it's a time for us to build a machine. I'll build two machines. One is in subnet 1 public, other one is subnet 2 private. So let's do this. I'll duplicate this tab. Launch instance. You need to enable public IP so that you can connect to this IP and then verify on VM2. So this is VM1 VPC, making sure it is in public subnet. That's right. Add storage, let it be all default options. Security group, if you remember, we have set up a default security group which was created by default when a VPC is created. Okay, this security group we have set inbound and outbound to allow all traffics. So I'll not create a new security group. Instead, I'll go with the existing security group. I'll review and launch. So here I have a key pair which is downloaded already, so that I'll make sure that I'll use those. I'll use that key pair to get my Windows credentials, Windows administrator credentials. Now my first machine is being deployed. Meanwhile, let me set a name. So this is what we did. Created a NAT gateway in public subnet 1, and you need to make a note that NAT gateway required a private IP and an internet gateway. Hence, it needs to be created under public subnet 1. Create VM1 public under public subnet 1. Let's do this. Excuse me. VM1 public. And now let me create a new machine. Let me assign this machine to VM2, sorry, private subnet 2. And you need to assign a public IP because public IP, when we assign a public IP, through this IP, it will communicate to NAT gateway, and NAT gateway in turn will communicate to internet gateway to fetch required DNS resolutions or internet requests. If we don't assign a public IP, in that case, the communication between VM2, subnet 2, and NAT gateway would be failed. Okay, you must and should enable a public IP. Remember, enabling public IP doesn't mean that external users can use this public IP to connect to the machine. No, even though we create a public IP, external users are not allowed to connect to this machine. I'll show you once this machine is built. Everything is same. I'm using the default security group. So now my second machine that is being deployed. Let me check the status of first machine. And meanwhile, I can rename this machine as VM2 subnet VM2 private. And save this. Okay, so let's quickly connect to VM1, and I can see my VM1 have a public IP address. Prior to that, I need to get a Windows credential by pointing my private key, Raju private key, decrypt. I'll just make a note of this password. So now let me connect to my first machine. I have the password, and you can see my first machine is perfectly connecting. So connection is being established now. Now I need to connect to VM2 from VM1 through a private IP. As you all know, VM in subnet 1 can communicate to VM in subnet 2 by default because VPC enables connection to all virtual machines within the common VPC. Example, a VPC can have 256 subnets, and each subnet can have 256 IP addresses. Okay, and usable IP addresses are 251 in a given subnet. So VM1 in subnet 1 can communicate to all 256 subnets without any restriction by default. By mentioning that, I'm gonna connect to my VM2. Prior to that, I just need to collect my credentials. Oh, I have to point to this. So here I have my credential. Let me make a note. Right, you can see I just made a note of VM2 because at the time of connecting to VM2, it required a credential. So let us verify VM2 IP address. VM2. Yeah, here you can see the IP address. 10.0.1.44. I'll click on connect. Here it will ask you for credential. Default username is administrator for all Windows machines. The password is the one which I have just copied here. So this could be because of the password which is generated. I would have not copied correctly, or I would have missed some configuration. Let me quickly get the password once again. It's asking for Raju private key. That's fine. Raju, decrypt the password, copy the password. As you can see, I missed something. That's why it was not allowing earlier. Now it's allowing absolutely fine. And you can see connection inside a connection. So first I connected to VM1 using the public IP, and now I'm connecting to private VM. And remember, private VM is not connected to internet gateway directly. It is using a NAT gateway. So let us quickly test internet connection on this machine. You can see internet is working. That is because I have added a new route under private route table pointing to NAT gateway. So I'll test it in the browser as well. It works fine. Okay. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if any user who's trying to connect to the VM2 through a public IP, connection should not be established. This is VM2 subnet. Sorry. Uh, Here I gave him a name like VM2 subnet, but actually it is VM2 private. Remember, we'll come back to this and try to connect to this machine. You see, it will not establish a connection to this machine. If you want to connect to VM2, you have to use a private IP address. As yeah, you can see the connection is failed. And as like we tried, we connected to VM1 using public IP, and internally we connected to VM2 using private IP in subnet 2 or private subnet. Okay, yeah, that's all about it. Thank you.